Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. We're just getting started at the CBAA Women and Gender Non-Conforming Peoples webinar. Without further ado, I think it might be best if we dive right in, but thank you all for coming along tonight. I'm just going to share some slides. All right, so here we are in the Women's Forum follow-up. Before we start this evening, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you tonight from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and becoming. I'd also like to extend that respect to the traditional owners of the land that you are joining us from, and also to any Indigenous people who may be here with us tonight. Welcome. This evening we have a number of things on the agenda. For those of you who are able to join us at the 2018 CBAA Women's Forum at the conference, that's great. Thanks for coming back. And I'm especially interested in hopefully hearing from some of you who couldn't make it to the Women's Forum this year or to the conference. So I think this is a really great opportunity to connect, and I'm really excited to have a chat. So thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight, we're going to do a bit of a quick recap of the 2018 Women's Forum discussion. So I'll let you know what we talked about, some of the suggestions that people made, and issues that were raised, I suppose. And then at the end, I've also allotted quite a lot of time for questions, suggestions, and a bit of a further discussion, hopefully. I'd really want to hear from you and learn from all of the expertise that you have at your own stations. So another thing that's happening is that we're forming a working group, hopefully, around trying to get some practical strategies in play for removing barriers for women and gender non-conforming people in community broadcasting. So keep that in mind. Also, this is my email address. I'm going to include that a lot of times this evening, but that is because I would love it if you emailed me. If you are keen to get in touch about anything, especially the working group, but if you have any questions or you want to discuss anything further, that is how you can find me, emma.hart@gmail.com. Okay, so diving right in. This is the agenda from the CBAA Women's Forum at the 2018 conference. So this is just a sort of a quick look at the things we talked about if you weren't there. And so I'll be running through mostly items 2 and 3. You can see removing barriers and mentors were the main things we discussed. As you can see as well, the conference was also held at lunchtime, and that's one of the things we discussed as well, maybe allotting a different time for the Women's Forum. So if you are an attendee of the forum and didn't fill out the survey, or you're thinking of coming in future, I'd love to hear from you. And we'll also be chatting about the election guidelines for the role of the women's representative, because at the moment it's all quite ad hoc. So we've been working on documenting that process a bit better. Going forward, so I'm just going to talk at you for a while. I hope that's all right. But if you want to get in touch, I think I'm just going to exit out of here. I think I can see you if you try and get my attention. So if there is something you would like to raise or jump in, I think you can do that. Otherwise, I'll be opening everything up for a more detailed conversation at the end. All right, so we'll just jump back to full screen mode. So this was one of the main things we talked about at the Women's Forum. So How can we remove barriers for women and gender non-conforming people to participate at stations? So this is obviously a pretty broad topic, and when we open the floor for discussion, there were sort of several general things that were raised as part of that, which I think are important to keep in mind going forward with this. So one of the main things that struck me was someone brought up that diversity really has to be seen as an ongoing project. We can't take our eyes off the ball for a second, otherwise we go backwards. So it's not as though we can perform a series of actions and just have everything be fine after that. It's really a slow process that we really need to focus on keeping moving at all times. Another thing that someone raised in terms of barriers to participation for women and GNC folk at stations is that sometimes that can be really around the presence and behaviour of men. That can have a real impact on the participation of women and gender diverse people. So the example that was raised was your first experience of going into a community radio station or even ringing a station. So, you know, who answers the phone, what they say to you, who you see when you walk into the station, all of that stuff really makes an impact. So looking at ways of creating space for women and GNC people was part of that discussion as well, which we'll get to in a moment. It was also raised, and I think this is really important, that women and people of colour face specific challenges with appointments as staff and board members and getting on the air. So really looking at the issue of gender diversity from a very intersectional approach. So looking at other forms of oppression people may experience, other difficulties people might have, and looking at how we can do our best to support all of the different women and gender diverse people in the sector, which is super important. Yeah, so there were some programs and initiatives that people raised. So hopefully I don't do a terrible job of articulating what everyone brought up, because there were many great ideas and lots of really wonderful contributions that I'm just sort of going to reference briefly now. So following on from what I was just mentioning was that one really key thing is to create spaces explicitly for women and gender diverse people. So one example of that is International Women's Day broadcasts, which I think lots of stations celebrate or recognise International Women's Day. One thing we do here at PBS, I'm joining you from the PBS Music Library tonight in Melbourne, so that's what all the CDs are in the background. One thing that PBS does is that we have all women and GNC broadcasters for the full 24 hours of International Women's Day, and I'm sure a lot of other stations do that sort of thing as well. So that's just a really straightforward example of creating space for women on the air. We also try and have women techs and broadcast support as well, which I think is also pretty important. Someone from 4EB raised that they are having quarterly women's lunches, which have been really successful in sort of changing station culture. I think it was brought up that it's lunch and training together, and that has really helped, I suppose, change station culture, but also help women feel more confident, you know, adjust to the idea of having a voice and a position in the station. And now the station actually has a board with more than 50% women and staff at the station, except in the tech area. And they also have the first female station manager in the station's history. So that is pretty exciting, I think, and a really good example of community building just on a really ad hoc basis. I mean, obviously it's organised, but I mean in terms of relationships. So a formal process, developing informal networks that really help support women within that station. At 3CR, which is another station I'm involved in here in Melbourne, they have the Live to Air Tech training. That is a program for women and gender non-conforming people, and also other people who might have difficulty getting a seat at the table. So, for example, people who aren't women in GNC but might have difficulty for other reasons, or sort of be statistically excluded. So people of colour, Aboriginal people, Indigenous people. And what that program does is they get an experienced tech from the ABC who donates his time, which is amazing. And they teach everyone how to put bands live to air in the station studios. So you learn everything from right at the beginning, setting up mic stands and signal flow, all of that, to sort of some of the subtleties of mixing. And there have been lots of really amazing women and gender non-conforming people come through that program who now can contribute to the station, and also work around Melbourne doing audio tech work as well, which is pretty amazing. We also heard about a weekly program which is put to air by a women's group at Ngada Media in the Pilbara, and that focuses around each show has a different theme. For example, one theme that Tanjura raised was that it's okay to say no. That's one of the things they've covered. And on the show, elders and experts speak on the topic, as well as their own lived experiences. And that sounds like a really amazing program as well. Again, just explicitly creating space for women on the air. And there were also some examples of sort of less formal but still effective methods. So programs focusing on building relationships and technical skills, making women feel like they can be there and be supported by other women. One example of that was that I think it was organised, I can't remember which station, sorry, but it was organised for women to come along repeatedly with OB texts to learn about outside broadcasts and sort of build relationships, learn skills, and get to know some new things there as well. All right, I'm going to turn off my video now because I'm sure you're used to my face by now, but I am still here. So moving forward, those are some programs and initiatives around just practical things that stations have already been doing. Looking at another key factor is policy. So in addition to really practical hands-on things, we also talked about, I suppose, station environments, and part of the environment that people exist in at stations is formed by policy. So a key thing that people in management and board roles can do is ensure that there are good policies in place to encourage gender diversity in stations, and also provide safe environments for people to work in from an industrial perspective as well. So a couple of things that were raised in relation to this conversation about policy that I thought was super great were that I suppose the general point that policy really provides a foundation for enforcement. So if it's there in black and white, it really reiterates that equity and diversity are important because it's in the policy. So it's a really valuable tool for station staff to point to. Sort of, it means you don't have to stick out your neck so much to or go out on a limb to deal with situations where something not quite right or sometimes very awful is happening. So that's, I think fairly straightforward. It's pretty useful from that perspective. But it was also brought up that even opening the conversation to try and get better policy, or in some instances a policy at all, is a really important part of the conversation. Just opening up that discussion and raising it at an organisational level can, even if you don't reach the finish line and get a full policy over the line, I think even raising those discussions can be really valuable. I thought that was a really good point too that someone at the forum raised as well. Interestingly, we did a quick poll of the room in the forum, a show of hands, and that indicated that many stations actually don't have a sexual harassment policy, a specific one. Often it can fall under a bullying and harassment policy. But I think really there needs to be a specific sexual harassment policy. And it was interesting how many really quite well-resourced stations as well don't have things like that. And I think that points to broader, complicated and problematic cultures that we all live and work in. So I think that is something to consider in this conversation going forward as well. So next slide, policy resources. There were some really good ones that came up at the forum. The CBAA already provides free access to policies that you can use as templates or the basis to develop your own. You can also chat to the CBAA about that as well and get some support there. But those policies that the CBAA provides already are around workplace bullying, anti-discrimination and equal employment opportunities, sometimes known as EEO, recruitment policies, volunteer agreements, and so much more. So I think that all of that is super useful, even just to have a look at whether you're a volunteer or staff, and that's at that URL there. I'm just going to have a look at this chat window and see what's happening. Just give me a moment. Okay. And the other thing is we also have, the CBAA has resources around sexual harassment as well. So some really good general information around, resources, your obligations as stations, things you can do to help. And there's also, I think, access to a previous webinar there, which is great. I think with someone from the Victorian Trades Hall Council around workplace sexual harassment and things you can do. So you can have a look back at that webinar as well if you want some extra info. So those are just some, I suppose, policy resources to get started with right at the beginning. There's also, excitingly, new resources coming out from the CMTO, the Community Media Training Organisation. They've been developing station diversity and inclusion policies, which will be rolled out in March 2019. So that is going to be a really valuable resource for the sector. So pretty excited to see what comes out of that. A representative from Hobart FM at the forum also made lots of really valuable contributions to the discussion and let us know about their experience developing a whole suite of policies at once for the station because there was a bit of a gap there. And they've now also offered to make those policies available for other people to have a look at and use if they want to. So huge props to Hobart FM for that work. You can find them at that URL as well. So the other resources which are worth noting are the community broadcasting codes of practice. So I'm sure when you started out as your volunteer training or your first radio experiences, people probably mentioned these to you. They're a pretty foundational document for the sector. And they contain lots of information about complaints processes and the kinds of things your station should be doing as well, especially in broadcast terms, to make it a fair place that supports a community radio kind of ethos. So they're definitely worth having a look at. They're also currently being reviewed, and this is potentially, it was raised at the forum by one of the forum participants, whether there's an opportunity here for us to see if we can try and get something included particularly around gendered violence and sexual harassment in the code. So if you have any questions about that process or feedback or suggestions, that process will be managed by Holly Friedlander Litigate, the CBAA's Government Relations Officer. That's her email there. There's going to be a proper consultation process as well. So that will be starting, I'm not sure about the timing, but you will be filled in on all of the details and definitely have the opportunity to have your say around that as well. So that's something to keep in mind too. This is just a picture of a place I like in Tasmania because I thought there's been a lot of dot points so far and we all might like to just take a moment. This is Wineglass Bay, where I was lucky enough to go on holidays as a kid. I grew up in Tasmania. So sometimes when I'm in the middle of a bit of a governance knot, this is one of the calm things that I think about. So I hope it's enjoyable and some nice eye rest for you. So just a serenity moment there. Okay, and we're good. We'll keep going on. So the next discussion point we had at the forum, so the next item on the agenda that we really spent a lot of time chatting about was around mentorship, which is, I think, something that's been proven to be really successful and valuable tool for helping women and GNC people become or stay involved in community broadcasting and also get further in their community broadcasting work. So two of the main things we looked at here were what can we do informally across the sector, and also what can we do more formally, so what can sector organisations be doing. As some context for this discussion, it's worth noting as well that last year women in staff roles in the sector I think actually had a small fall from 44% to 42%. That's in the CBAA Financial Health of Community Radio report. Thanks for that info, Helen. And it's also worth noting as well from an intersectional perspective, so looking at more complex societal factors as well as gender, that, for example, women of colour have lower representation than those figures above. And for example, if they are hired in staff roles or on air, they are often pushed out more quickly. There was actually a really amazing presentation from Antoinette Latouf, who's the director and co-founder of Media Diversity Australia, at the conference this year. I highly recommend checking out their website. They've got some great resources on there, including an Indigenous media handbook, which looks pretty good in terms of best practice around that, but also just in terms of opening more general discussions around media diversity in Australia, which obviously community media is a super important part of too. So that's just sort of some context for the things we chatted about. Mentoring ideas and resources. So we had a really productive discussion at the forum where lots of people put forward what their stations have been doing or what they're aware of that has been successful in the not-for-profit sector as well around mentoring for women and gender non-conforming people. And as some more context for this, it was also noted that informal mentoring based on relationships can actually often be more successful than formal programs, which for some reason often seem to run out of energy. Some of them are great and very successful, but it can be quite difficult to put a lot of energy into getting that sort of thing off the ground and keeping it going. And sometimes just a direct interpersonal approach can be really effective as well. So looking at some of the ideas that people put forward, there were some questions around sector funding for management training with a focus on women and leadership. And I think that there are potentially some promising developments from the CMTO around that as well. It was also raised that the CBAA Conference could be a really excellent opportunity to facilitate mentoring for women and GNC people particularly. So there's already a mentoring program as part of that, but we looked at whether that could be expanded or looking into that sort of thing. So that is something to look into for next year as well. There's also looking into existing resources in stations. So working with OB teams to gain skills was the example that's put forward. I actually mentioned that in the last section. So that, is a situation where I think women were paired up with OB techs who are men, and then they work together to gain skills, learn new stuff, meet new people, and really gain that expertise to feel a bit more confident in that environment and be able to carry off the work successfully. A shadowing program for station managers was also suggested. So that's looking at sort of management development kind of area. So that could work at where a mentee shadows the station manager for a week if the station manager is amenable to that. So again, a really sort of direct process for someone to learn new skills or have a new perspective they wouldn't otherwise have access to. It was also brought up that training at a station level and also formal studies can be really good opportunities to start mentorships. So there's a couple of things to unpack in there. Training at a station level. So those of you who are on the air would have undertaken broadcast training most probably as part of your start at your respective stations. So it's a great, those trainers in that moment are really accessible to people who are right at the start of their community broadcasting journey. And that is a great time to ask for, I suppose, further mentorship beyond the training, or ask trainers about that and maybe be paired up with someone at the station more formally. So that's just a really straightforward thing that could be incorporated into training programs without too much hassle. Also more formal studies. So for example, if someone's at university or studying at another institution, you know, you can approach tutors, teachers, lecturers, and it was brought up in this discussion that, you know, if your lecturer is a woman and, you know, you're asking about their expertise and asking for support, probably they, you know, will understand where you're coming from and be a bit flattered as well. So it can be a really good, good way to form a mentorship there as well, just taking some initiative and going for it. So I guess that sort of covers the next point as well. Asking someone you admire and asking to spend some time with them can be a good option. And again, those sort of direct approaches, I think, can be really effective. Looking at some more formal programs and resources, so it sounds like there are some really amazing ones as well. A couple of people brought up the Observership program. So that is unfortunately only on the southeast coast at this stage, I think, so in Sydney and Melbourne. But basically what it does is it allows people who don't have a lot of governance experience to sit on boards and gain that experience. So the web address is there on your screen, observership.com.au. And basically what happens is that you are allotted a not-for-profit charity organisation and you go along to their board meetings, and that's sort of all a formal process. So all of the legal side of that is catered for and looked after, because obviously there are some confidentiality issues, for example, around that sort of thing. Yeah, so that looks like it is a really good program too. Also, if you're a station manager or staff at a station who just happens to be tuning in and your station has charity status, it's also worth noting as well that stations with charity status can also sign up for the program, which is great. So you could, for example, host someone. Sorry, I'm just trying to look at my chat messages in something, in case something terrible is happening. Okay, so just taking a quick pause. We're getting some great resources from Helen in the chat. So if you're not looking at that, please do check out those links from her as well. There's some really excellent, yeah, some of the things we've been discussing. So you can absolutely jump in there and grab some of those web addresses. Thanks for that, Helen. Another resource that was discussed is the sort of things that existing programs or resources is the Women in Community Radio Facebook group, which I finally posted in today. So hello to you all who are members of that Facebook group. So again, I suppose that's an opportunity to ask through social networks for people with the skills and expertise you're looking for, that you need. So we sort of had a bit of a chat at the forum about looking into, I mean, that Facebook group is already fairly active and has many great members, but maybe looking into rejuvenating it a bit, and sort of building up a culture where people can ask about mentors or ask about questions they're having, or, you know, conundrums they're having at their stations, sort of asking for support, advice, resources, that sort of thing. Yeah, but also especially mentorship, meeting other people in the sector who can give you the info that you need, because sometimes it can be hard to find. Yeah, and feeling isolated in stations is absolutely something that women and gender diverse people experience. So that's a really direct way to combat that. Yeah. Other things we discussed were directories of skilled women and gender diverse people who could be approached about mentorships. So we sort of talked about starting our own, but that is a very big project. Maybe put it on the community radio wish list down the line. But there are also already some existing resources. So someone suggested Here She Is, which is a directory of all sorts of different women and gender diverse experts. So if you're looking for someone to talk to you about something, or that you are looking for some advice about something, you can find someone most likely through that database, which is great. From a more music perspective, I also wanted to mention Listen Lists, which is something that Listen, which is a feminist music organisation, a grassroots organisation which started a few years in Melbourne. They're really excellent, have started. That's their initiative. So that is a list of all sorts of different women in music, from session musicians to audio technicians, to music teachers. Yeah, and so you can sort of find everyone easily in one place. So women and gender diverse people in that one as well. So that's just two examples. I'm sure there are also other lists as well, so that's worth looking into. The other thing we discussed as part of the mentoring conversation was putting together a bit of a cheat sheet on mentoring and trying to make that available via the CBAA website. So if someone comes along and is doing a search for mentors, or community radio, community broadcasting, and find mentor, they can get access to some of the resources we just discussed, and have some strategies there too. So that is the sort of the end of the mentorship section as well. So now we're on to the next agenda item. I'm aware that it is already been half an hour, so don't worry, we're nearly there. And then we can all have a chat. And I'd love to hear from you about some of the things you've been doing and your thoughts as well. But yeah, the next agenda item that we covered at the forum was the Women's Representative Election Guidelines, which I really wanted to show you all in the webinar tonight, because obviously it's pretty relevant to you all in the sector. So for some background, at the 2017 Women's Forum at the CBAA Conference, there was a motion passed that we should draw up some guidelines around the election of the women's representative, because at the moment this process, even though it's very clear what should happen, there isn't actually really a lot of formal documentation around it and how it works. And from a governance perspective, that is a great thing to have, because that means you avoid inconsistencies, lack of clarity. Just makes the whole thing a lot better, or stronger or more robust, I suppose, from a governance perspective. So the CBAA Women's Rep, that is me, I've been working with a small working group to draft guidelines for consideration by the CBAA board, which I'm about to show you. So it's important to bear in mind that this is a draft at this stage, so it might not be, this is not the final document potentially, but I just wanted to show you where things are at and get some feedback, if anything. And just emphasize as well, we're not really making any changes. It's more a process to strengthen governance, and just I suppose make the women's representative position as strong as it can be. So get ready. There's a lot of text on the next page. I'm just going to go through these a little bit and just chat a little bit about each part. As you can see at the top, these guidelines are a draft for discussion. You can provide some feedback to Holly. That's her email address. You can also provide feedback to me. My email address is at the end of this document, just to sort of dovetail that with some email addresses. So there's the first paragraph is the sort of, I guess, the preamble that provides a bit of context. We mentioned the Women's Forum because there actually isn't really formal mention of the Women's Forum in the Constitution guidelines, governing documents around the conference or the CBAA. So we kind of need to mention that just to provide some context for the election of the position. And then we have the nomination process. So it's fairly straightforward. I wanted to emphasize under 2C that, First Nations people, people of colour, culturally and linguistically diverse people, and members of the LGBTIQA+ community, as well as people with disabilities, are really encouraged to nominate. I think that's really good to have in black and white. Also nomination, this is sort of more about the nomination process up the top. This is all standard, same as the youth rep position at this stage. Each person at the forum has one vote, just to clarify as well. So it's different from the station voting system that happens in the main AGM session at the conference. This is all sort of adapted from the CBAA Constitution as well. 3.2, how voting is carried out. So nothing especially groundbreaking there. This is just to clarify the position of the women's representative in relation to the board, because that's a great thing to do from a governance perspective as well, because that makes that really clear where everyone stands, and so you don't get, for example, regular directors in comparison to the representatives, so you don't end up with a bit of a legal tangle there. So that's a good thing to do. So here is my email address as promised. If you would like some more information about this process, if I went too fast, or if you have any feedback, please shoot me an email. You can also get in touch with Holly. In the next few months, we'll be looking into this further as well. So the last thing we sort of dealt with on the forum agenda was the scheduling of the Women's Forum at future conferences. So I don't know how many of you were at the conference, so I don't know, or plan to be at future conferences, so I'm not sure how relevant this is to you. But basically, if you're thinking of coming in future, or if you are a regular attendee, the current situation is that the Women's Forum is at lunchtime, and I think it's been that way for a long time, mostly so everyone can go. So the idea is that it doesn't clash with anything, and that you can get along, which makes a lot of sense. But from another perspective, it would also be good to have a little bit more time. So we did a survey about when people would most like the Women's Forum to be. And the most popular survey results were during lunch, so the current option, as an extended workshop, so a workshop plus a bit. And then there was another option that was quite popular as well that we made up on the spot and added to the survey, and that is that the forum happens during lunch plus a 1-hour workshop. So you sort of get 2 hours, but you only lose 1 hour of programming from the main conference program, because obviously that's lunch and an hour workshop. So if you have any feelings about that, again, you can get in touch with me. I think that it would be good to look into that next year for conference planning. Huge props to the CBAA staff who plan the conference. It is so much work and they do such an excellent job. And I think that juggling all of the scheduling needs is a bit of a nightmare. So it is really good for them to have some feedback too around what you want and what works best for you as conference participants. As well as this, it was also suggested that we might like to hold a separate workshop to the Women's Forum to discuss issues relevant to our part of the sector, so especially removing barriers for participation of women in stations, and make that separate workshop able to be attended by people of any gender. So, for example, men could come along to that one. So a separate event to the Women's Forum where we can discuss important stuff relevant to women and gender diverse people in the sector, where men can come too and have a chat, learn some things, listen, hopefully come away with some ideas. So if we could do that, we could have, our organising space, which is just us, and then we could also have a sort of more educational space too, which could be really good. All right, we're at the questions section. So I am going to make this screen smaller and then hopefully figure out how we are able to have a chat together as well. So I can see that there are a few of you here with us, which is great. So I was wondering if any of you have any contributions to make around the things we've discussed tonight. So I feel like I've really been talking a lot, so now's your chance. If you have anything you'd like to contribute, you can just hit the raise hand button on your sharing thing if you want to talk, and then I can click yes and we can have a chat and everyone can hear it, I think is how it works. So there are a couple of questions here. So first of all, how can we remove barriers for women and gender non-conforming people to participate at stations? So what are some things that you've been doing at your station, or what strategies have you tried, or what do you think could work well? Does anyone have anything they'd like to say about that? I'm not going to make anyone talk if they don't want to as well. But if you are interested, you're very welcome to have a chat now. You can also mention it in the chat window as well, I think, maybe. Also, moving on to the next question, mentoring. So if you have any ideas for how women and gender diverse people can connect with experienced community radio makers, especially other women and GNC people, I'd love to hear from you. I mean, what mentoring strategies and success stories have happened at your station? Do you have any ideas, any lists to contribute, anything like that? Okay, well, I would love to hear from you in future. If you are not feeling very talkative this evening, that is fine, but you can also chat via direct message. Helen is just saying as well, via text, if you want to jump in the chat window. But you can also contact the CBAA office if you have any suggestions, or myself as well. Yeah. As well, I mean, if you don't have anything sort of specific around either of those topics, the barriers or the mentoring, do you have any feedback about tonight's chat? I mean, it would be great to hear what you were hoping to get out of today's session by attending the Women's Forum. Okay, so great. Beck has said something in the webinar chat. Thanks so much, Beck. Yeah, that is really a really important point. Women have so many roles to play, and those are often conflicting. Yeah, and childcare is a huge one. I was actually just thinking about that today, because a colleague of mine who I'd really like to attend this webinar is looking after her kids right now. So I think as well, especially in community broadcasting, where lots of things happen at funny times and hours, that can be really not super conducive to making things really accessible for women with childcare responsibilities. So again, I think that can really be addressed from an organisational perspective. So if station staff or management or boards have in their heads that strategically they want to make their stations more accessible to people who have family responsibilities, you can schedule things that are either child-friendly, or you can put things at times where you'll be more likely to be able to attend or find someone to care for your children. So, for example, during school hours. You can also look at childcare options. Yeah, there's lots of opportunities there, I think, to improve. But yeah, I think that most of the women and gender diverse people I know in community radio do a lot of things. Yeah, and definitely some of those things conflict. And I think as well, because so much of our sector is volunteer based, that really plays into that too. You know, it's hard to get time to do things for free when you have a lot of responsibilities. So yeah, thanks very much for that contribution, Beck. Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we could look into in terms of forming a strategy going forward around sort of removing those sorts of barriers. So encouraging stations to just consider that some of their broadcasters have caring responsibilities for children when they're structuring how their station's set up. I know it's difficult at small stations as well, where you have sort of smaller resources. Yeah. Oh, there's some great questions coming through. Okay, thanks everyone. I will address them in order. So a question from Tia. Thanks, Tia. I wonder if Emma has any advice or tips that come from her own experience about how, as a woman, to get more involved. Oh, thanks, Tia. That's a very personal question. You know what? I think I just had it really easy, to be quite honest. I am a single woman and, well, I don't have a partner with children anyway, and I live in a big city with lots of opportunities in central Melbourne. And also I got involved in radio at 3CR, community radio, which is a station that has really great inclusive policies and approaches to things. You know, like any station, 3CR isn't perfect, but I reckon it's pretty good. And they made it really easy as a woman to feel valuable and to get involved. For example, my first broadcasting role when I started in 2014 was as a presenter on the Tuesday breakfast current affairs show at 3CR. So at 3CR, they have different breakfast teams each morning. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday all have a different team. And the Tuesday team is reserved especially for women and gender non-conforming people. So actually my first broadcast role on air was specifically for women and GNC folk. That team at the moment actually has a number of really amazing women of colour on it as well. If you want to tune into another station, it's definitely worth a listen. They cover all sorts of amazing stuff and actually play great music too. It's everything you could want from breakfast radio. Yeah, so I think I was just very lucky. I had a very positive experience. Yeah. I think a lot of people have a lot more difficulty than me and really persevere. And I think that how many amazing, experienced and new broadcasters we have in the sector who are women and gender non-conforming people is a real testimony to the perseverance and strength and passion of the women in our sector. So, yeah. We've got a great question from Aguer as well. It's lovely to hear from you. So is it possible to form a team of women in radio in Melbourne? So a group of multicultural women. Aguer says, I feel like we women of colour lack a safe space where we can share our challenges and experiences. No worries about the typo. I think that is a really important point. Yeah, I think that it would be really wonderful to have that, especially for multicultural women in radio in Melbourne. And if you like Aguer, we can work together to try and get that happening. I know that there are informal community radio drinks more generally, but I think it would be really great to have something a bit more focused as an organising space, and especially to connect with other women and people of colour, I think is super crucial. So thanks so much for that suggestion. I will get in touch with you after tonight's webinar and see if we can start something happening. Maybe we can begin with the Facebook group. We can have a bit of a call out and we can sort of collaborate there. I know that there are some really amazing communities of radio makers who are women and people of colour here in Melbourne. So it would be wonderful to hook into that and maybe, if possible, somehow gradually extend that further afield as well. So thanks again. Great suggestion. So does anyone else have any other questions or suggestions that they would like to mention? I guess on the topic of, I'm still looking at the chat window and can listen, so feel free to jump in. But yeah, sort of more broadly on the topic of forming groups, I guess this brings me to my next point, which is I think you can still see my screen, but that's the around the working group. So one of the things that we did at the Women's Forum was have a chat about forming this working group that can develop some really practical strategies that maybe we can look at more broadly across the sector for helping community broadcasting be more inclusive for women and gender non-conforming people, and especially from an intersectional approach. So looking at the extra barriers faced by, for example, women and people with disabilities, women of colour, people from different language backgrounds, all of those sorts of things. So, we would meet about every 2 and a bit months by phone. So something maybe like by Skype or through a Zoom meeting thing like the thing we're in today, but sort of a bit more open, not just one person talking so much, obviously. And in that group, it would be really wonderful to have volunteers who are from diverse backgrounds, and also people from rural and remote stations. So we have a pretty good group beginning to form from people who volunteered at the forum, which is really exciting. And I'll be trying to chase up a couple of other people from parts of the sector that I think would be really valuable. But if any of you here tonight are keen to be part of the working group and contribute to that strategy building, that would be wonderful if you wanted to volunteer. I'll also try and be pretty regular about sort of reporting back about what we're doing and asking for broader opinions and consultation as well. So you don't have to get right in there at the start. But I think that is a really great way to be involved. And if you are keen, I would love you to be on board. So you can, again, there's my email address again. So you can email me about that as well if you like. So more broadly around keeping in touch, it's my email again. I've really gone overboard here, but I guess the general message is that if you do want to get in touch with me as the CBAA Women's Representative, I am available and I will try and get back to you as quickly as I can. Another great way to stay in touch with other people in the sector is the Women in Community Radio Facebook group, which we posted in about today's webinar. And there's also the good old-fashioned method of just picking up the phone. So you can reach the CBAA on that number, 93102999, with the New South Wales area code in front, 02. That someone on the other end of the phone, maybe Danny Chifley, possibly Holly Friedlander Litigate as well, though I know she has a whole new role, possibly Helen. Someone will be able to point you in the right direction and put us in touch if that is the best thing to do. So don't be shy. We want to hear from you. And at 7:24 p.m. in Melbourne time, that brings us to the end of the session. So thank you so much for coming along tonight, and also especially for your contributions. I really appreciate you letting me know your thoughts. I know it's not easy to talk to people you don't really know on the internet through a computer, so I really appreciate you speaking up there. I appreciate your feedback. I've taken that on board, and I hope this has been valuable for you as well. You know how to find me if you want to get in touch further. And we actually have the next webinar coming up, which is on the 12th of December, and that will be around the Youth Forum. So if you haven't noticed already, we're doing things a little bit differently. Normally we have the youth and women's webinars before the conference, but we thought probably have more to talk about and a more structured discussion afterwards. So again, thanks so much for coming along. And with that, I reckon we are done for this evening, but please do contact me if you have any questions or you'd just like to say hello. And it's been a real pleasure speaking with you all tonight. Thanks so much.